I said yes to the cruise because I wanted one last chance. Claire stood in the kitchen, arms folded, watching me pack. It will be good for us, I said. She nodded without smiling. My parents think so, she replied. That answer stayed with me as we boarded the ship with her family, smiling for photos, acting steady. At dinner, Linda reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We are glad you came, she said. Families need time together. I thanked her and meant it. Claire stared at her plate. You could try the fish, Linda told her. Claire shrugged. Maybe later. I asked, are you okay? She said, I am fine, and changed the topic. I told myself to relax. On the deck, a man stepped beside me and offered a drink. Mark, he said. I have known Claire since she was a kid. He spoke easily, like we were already friends. You are the lucky one, he added. I laughed. I hope so. He smiled too long. Cruises fix things, he said. They always do. I wanted to believe him. That night, Claire and I sat in our cabin. The waves tapped the window. I said, I miss you. She said, I am tired. I asked, did I do something wrong? She rubbed her temples. Not now. I said, we promised to talk. She answered, we will. I watched her turn away, and my chest tightened. The next morning, Linda knocked early. Breakfast on the sun deck, she said brightly. Claire groaned. Go without me. Linda glanced at me, then forced a smile. She needs rest. At breakfast, Mark pulled out a chair beside me. How is she? He asked. I said, quiet. He nodded. She gets like that. I wondered how he knew. Later, Claire joined us, late and distracted. Mark stood to greet her. Hey, he said softly. She smiled at him, quick and easy. I felt small. I asked, want to walk later? Claire said, maybe. Mark said, I can show you the upper deck. Claire said, that could be nice. I swallowed and said nothing. That afternoon, Linda found me by the rail. You look serious, she said. I answered, I want to make this work. She patted my arm. Love is patience. I said, and honesty. She paused. Of course. The pause felt heavy. I stared at the water and promised myself I would try harder. At dinner, I raised a toast. To new starts, I said. Glasses clinked. Claire met my eyes for a second. Mark watched us, smiling. Linda said, unity matters. I nodded. Inside, worry pressed on me. I told myself it was fear talking. I told myself the trip would heal us. I did not know it was already testing me. I lay awake later, listening to voices in the hall. Claire slipped out quietly. I asked, where are you going? She said, just air. I said, come back soon. She said, do not wait up. The door closed. My phone buzzed with a message from Linda. Trust takes time, it read. I typed, I trust her. I was trying to convince myself. I walked to the deck and met Mark again. Beautiful night, he said. I agreed. He asked, you nervous? I said, I care. He smiled and said, caring is risky. Before sleep, I faced my reflection and practiced calm words. I told myself, listen first. I told myself, be patient. In the cabin, Claire returned and avoided my eyes. I said, I want us. She said, I know. I asked, can we start fresh here? She answered, we will try. I reached for her hand. She let me, then pulled away. I whispered, I love you. She replied, I am trying. I lay back, hopeful and uneasy, believing effort would be enough. Morning plans filled the schedule, and I signed up for everything. I said yes to walks, meals, and games. Linda praised my spirit. Mark joked with ease. Claire smiled when others watched. I told myself smiles counted. I promised I would listen, speak gently, and hold steady. I believed love could be repaired with time and care. I did not see the cracks growing under my feet. I stepped onto the deck, breathed deep, and chose hope. I did not know hope can blind. I only knew I wanted us, and I believed this trip would prove it. I promised to give everything, even if it scared me. That was my plan then. Morning came with soft light and forced smiles. Claire sat across from me at breakfast, phone in her hand. I said, did you sleep well? She answered, fine, without looking up. Linda passed bread and said, today will be fun. Claire nodded, still scrolling. I asked, what are you reading? She said, nothing important. Mark slid into the chair beside her and said, morning. Claire smiled at him. That smile stayed with me. Later on the deck, I said, want to walk with me? Claire checked her phone again. Maybe later, she replied. Mark said, I can help you find the lounge. She said, that would help. I laughed lightly and said, I can show you too. She hesitated, then said, Mark knows the ship. I told myself it did not matter. During a family game, Mark stood close to Claire, whispering jokes. She laughed, head tilted back. I watched and felt slow heat in my chest. I said, You seem happy. She replied, I am relaxed. I asked, With me? She shrugged. With everyone. Mark met my eyes and said, Cruises do that. I nodded and swallowed my doubt. At lunch, Claire left early. I need air, she said. I asked, Want company? She answered, I will be quick. Mark stood. I will walk with her. I said, I can go. Claire said, It is fine. They left together. Linda said, Give her space. I smiled and said, Of course. By the pool, a man offered me a chair. Jason, he said, cousin by marriage. I shook his hand. He asked, First cruise? I said, First with family. He chuckled. People leave these trips different. I asked, Better? He replied, Different is not always better. He looked toward Claire and Mark. I followed his gaze. He said nothing else. That evening, I found Claire near the rail. You have been distant, I said. She replied, You are sensitive. I asked, Am I wrong? She said, I need space. I said, We came to reconnect. She answered, We came for family. That word felt sharp. Mark joined us and said, Dinner soon. Claire smiled and said, I forgot. She walked with him. I stood still. At dinner, Linda asked me about work. I answered politely. Claire laughed at something Mark said. I said, I miss talking with you. Claire replied, Not here. Linda cleared her throat. Let us enjoy the meal. I nodded. My food tasted dull. That night in the cabin, I said, Talk to me. Claire sat on the bed and said, I am tired. I asked, Tired of what? She said, Of pressure. I said, I am your partner. She answered, I know. I said, Then let me in. She looked away. Tomorrow. I watched her leave early again. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. My phone buzzed with a message from Jason. People show who they are when no one is watching. I typed, What do you mean? He replied, Just be awake. I set the phone down and listened to the ship hum. The next morning, Claire avoided my eyes. I said, Good morning. She said, Morning, already walking. Mark followed. At breakfast, I sat alone until Jason joined me. He said, You look tired. I answered, I am thinking. He said, Thinking saves pain sometimes. I asked, And sometimes? He smiled sadly. Sometimes it delays it. On the deck, I confronted my thoughts. I told myself I was jealous. I told myself this was her family. I told myself laughter meant nothing. I repeated these things until they sounded true. When Claire returned late again, I said nothing. She said, Do not wait up. I nodded. Alone in the dark, I wondered when love turned into silence. I wondered why I felt like I was losing a game I never agreed to play. I waited an hour before I stood up. Claire had said she needed air. I told myself to be calm. I walked the hall and called her name. A crew member stopped me and asked if I was lost. I said I was looking for my fiancée. He checked a screen and frowned. He said he saw her earlier. I asked where. He said a cabin on the lower deck. I asked whose. He hesitated and said Mark. My hands shook as I walked. I told myself there had to be a reason. I stopped outside the door. I listened. I heard voices inside. I knocked once. The door opened. Claire stood there. Her face went pale. Mark was behind her. He said nothing. I said her name. She said my name back. I asked what this was. She said it was not what it looked like. I asked why she was here. She said she needed to talk. I asked why with him. Mark finally spoke. He said calm words about misunderstanding. I raised my hand. I said stop. Claire tried to step closer. I stepped back. I said do not touch me. She started crying. I asked how long. She said it was complicated. I asked if she shared this cabin. She did not answer. I looked at Mark. I asked if he thought this was fine. He said he cared about her. I laughed once. It sounded empty. I said you both lied to me. Claire said she never meant to hurt me. I said intent does not erase choices. The hall felt small. I felt my chest tighten. I waited for anger. It did not come. I felt quiet. I said we are done. Claire shook her head. She said please. I said no more words. Mark stepped forward. I said stay back. He stopped. I told Claire to keep the ring. She said I could not leave like this. I said I already left. I turned away. I walked the hall slowly. My legs felt weak. I reached the stairs. I heard the door close behind me. I did not look back. I went to the deck. The night air felt cold. I leaned on the rail. I said nothing to anyone. My phone buzzed. I did not check it. I listened to my heart. It felt broken. I told myself to breathe. I stayed there a long time. When I finally moved, I felt older. I knew nothing would be the same. I did not cry. I felt empty. I walked back alone. In the cabin, I sat on the bed. I stared at the wall. I realized the trip was over for me. I heard laughter outside. It sounded far away. I lay back and closed my eyes. I replayed her voice. I replayed my calm words. They felt unreal. I whispered why. No answer came. I sat up and checked the time. It was late. I wondered if anyone would ask where I was. I wondered if she cared. I decided not to test that. I changed my shirt. I stood and faced the mirror. I looked tired. I said, "You kept your dignity." My voice shook. I said, "You walked away." I nodded to myself. I heard a knock. I opened the door. It was a staff member. He asked if I was all right. I said yes. He said there was concern. I said I needed rest. He nodded and left. I locked the door. I sat again. I felt the weight of truth settle. It was heavy. It was final. I lay down fully dressed. I stared at the ceiling. I accepted that love had ended. I accepted that I survived. My breath slowed. I felt something break quietly inside me. I did not scream. I did not beg. I let the silence stay. I closed my eyes. I knew tomorrow would hurt. I knew I would keep walking. I chose that promise. I held on to it. The ship moved on. So did I. I stayed awake until sleep took me. My last thought was simple. I would not chase anyone again. I would choose myself. That decision felt solid. It scared me. It also saved me. I breathed in. I breathed out. I waited for morning. I waited without hope. I waited with truth. It was enough. I turned on my side. I finally slept. I dreamed of quiet water. I woke later unchanged. I was done. Inside me, I woke up before the lights came on. Claire was already dressed. She said, "We need to talk." I replied, "Not now." She sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Please." I said, "I asked for space." She nodded and left. That was the last question I asked her. At breakfast, Linda waved me over. I shook my head. She followed me and said, "You cannot disappear." I said, "I can eat alone." She said, "Families heal together." I answered, "I am not family today." Her smile faded. She said, "Relationships are complicated." That sentence landed hard. I said, "Respect is not." She opened her mouth, then closed it. I walked away. On the deck, I leaned against the rail. An older man stood nearby. He said, "Quiet morning." I replied, "It helps." He introduced himself as Robert. He asked, "Rough night?" I said, "Rough truth." He nodded. "Truth can be loud." I said, "Silence hurts more." He smiled gently. "Silence teaches faster." We stood without talking. I felt understood without explanation. Later, Robert spoke again. "I once chased answers," he said. "I lost dignity." I asked, "Did you find it again?" He said, "When I stopped arguing with what happened." I said, "I am trying not to beg." He said, "Good choice." Those words settled inside me. Jason found me near the stairs. He said, "I am sorry." I asked, "For what?" He said, "I should have warned you." I said, "You knew?" He nodded. "We all did." I felt my chest tighten. I said, "So I was the last one." He said, "I thought it would stop." I replied, "Secrets grow." He lowered his head. "I know." I thanked him for honesty. It felt late. Claire tried again that afternoon. She said, "Can we sit?" I said, "No." She said, "I need to explain." I said, "Explanations protect choices." She whispered my name. I said, "Please stop." She cried. I walked past her. Each step felt heavy and right. At dinner time, Linda knocked. I did not answer. She said through the door, "You are hurting everyone." I said, "I am protecting myself." She said, "You cannot avoid this." I said, "I can choose quiet." She sighed and left. The hall felt calmer. I met Robert again by the lounge. He asked, "How are you holding?" I said, "I am steady." He said, "Steady beats loud." I asked, "Does it pass?" He said, "Pain changes shape." I nodded. I believed him. That night, I sat alone and wrote notes on my phone. I wrote, "Do not beg." I wrote, "Do not explain your worth." I wrote, "Leave with pride." The words felt like a promise. I read them twice. Claire messaged me. "I miss you," she wrote. I typed, "I need space." She replied, "Please." I did not answer. My hand stopped shaking. That felt new. In the morning, I passed Mark in the hall. He looked away. I said nothing. Silence felt strong. Jason nodded at me from across the deck. Linda avoided my eyes. I realized the truth had been shared and protected. I had been alone inside a crowd. Robert joined me once more. He said, "Leaving with dignity is winning." I said, "It does not feel like it." He replied, "It will." I looked at the water and believed him. I decided then. I would finish the cruise without arguments. I would keep my head high. I would leave with my pride intact. My heart was cracked, but it was still mine. I stood straighter. I chose quiet. I chose myself. I found Claire on the quiet side of the deck. She was crying. She said, "I cannot sleep. Please talk to me." I replied, "Say what you need." She wiped her face and said, "I was confused." I asked, "Confused enough to lie?" She said, "He understood me." That sentence cut deep. I said, "Understanding does not excuse secrets." She said, "You never listened." I said, "I listened while you hid." She reached for my arm. I stepped back. She said, "I love you." I answered, "Love does not live in secret cabins." She cried harder and said, "I made a mistake." I said, "You made choices." She asked, "Can you forgive me?" I said, "Forgiveness is not reunion." She shook her head and said, "Please." I said, "I choose myself." The words felt steady when I said them. She whispered my name. I said, "The engagement is over." She covered her mouth and said, "You cannot mean that." I replied, "I do." She said, "What about us?" I said, "Us ended when respect ended." She said, "I was lost." I said, "I will not be your lesson." She tried to explain Mark and said, "He listens." I said, "Listening without honesty is empty." She said, "I was scared." I said, "So was I." Silence stood between us, heavy and clear. Mark appeared near the rail and stopped when he saw me. He looked away. Claire said, "Do not leave." I said, "I already have." Mark walked off and never spoke to me again. That quiet felt final and clean. Later, Linda approached with tight lips. She said, "You are making this worse." I asked, "For who?" She said, "For the family." I replied, "I was never protected." She said, "Claire is hurting." I answered, "So am I." She looked disappointed at me, not her daughter. In that moment, I understood my place. I was temporary. That truth hurt, but it also freed me. Jason found me by the chairs. He said, "You did the right thing." I said, "It hurts." He replied, "It will hurt less than staying." I thanked him. I meant it more than he knew. I walked the deck alone and spoke quietly to myself. "I am done begging," I said. I felt taller saying it. I opened my phone and canceled plans that belonged to a future that no longer existed. I searched flights for one person. Each choice felt like air returning to my lungs. Claire sent a message that said, "I am sorry." I typed back, "Take care." I did not add anything else. My hands were steady, and that surprised me. That night, I slept without waiting for footsteps. In the morning, I met the day without dread. I planned work, friends, and quiet mornings that belonged only to me. The future no longer felt like a threat. It felt open. I stood at the rail and breathed in deeply. I said, "I choose myself." The words stayed with me. The ocean did not feel heavy anymore. It felt honest. I watched the horizon and smiled once. It was enough that I noticed the change without listening for it. Claire raised her voice near the elevators and said, "You promised." Mark replied, "Lower your voice." I kept walking. Jason caught up and said, "People are talking." I asked, "About what?" He said, "About them." I nodded and said, "Okay." At breakfast, Linda avoided my eyes. Claire sat stiff, barely eating. Mark stared at his plate. Linda said, "We should all relax." Claire snapped, "Stop pretending." Mark said, "Not here." Linda cleared her throat and said, "Enough." I drank my coffee and stayed silent. Silence felt like armor. Later, Jason sat beside me on the deck. He said, "They are fighting everywhere." I asked, "Why tell me?" He said, "Because you are calm." I replied, "I chose calm." He said, "It suits you." I thanked him and looked at the water. I passed Mark near the lounge. He did not smile. He said, "We need to talk." I replied, "No," he said, "You are enjoying this." I said, "I am living." He scoffed and walked away. That was the last time he spoke to me. That afternoon, I met Robert by the rail. He said, "You look lighter." I said, "I stopped carrying what was not mine." He nodded. Peace comes when you stop trying to be understood by people who chose not to see you. I said, I am learning. He smiled and said, good. Claire found me near the stairs. She said, they are judging me. I replied, I am not. She said, say something. I said, I already did. She looked tired. She said, he is different now. I answered, truth changes people. She said, I cannot fix this. I said, some things end. She turned away. Rumors moved faster than the ship. A couple whispered when Mark walked by. Someone laughed too loud when Claire passed. Linda tried to gather people for games. No one joined. At dinner, plates stayed full. Words tasted bitter. Jason leaned in and said, they asked if you knew. I asked, what did you say? He said, I said you knew enough. I said, thank you. He said, you handled it with class. I shrugged. I handled it with silence. Robert joined me again at sunset. He said, revenge tempts many. I said, I did nothing. He replied, exactly. He looked at the horizon. Karma does not rush. It waits. I breathed in and believed him. Claire argued with Mark near the pool. She said, you said this would be easy. He replied, you wanted this. She said, I wanted peace. He laughed without humor. I walked past them. Claire called my name. I did not stop. That night, Linda knocked on my door. I opened it. She said, this has gone too far. I asked, too far for who? She said, for all of us. I replied, truth arrived. She said, you could help calm this. I said, I am calm. She sighed and left. In the morning, I felt lighter. The pain still existed, but it no longer led me. I chose breakfast alone and enjoyed it. I chose a walk and enjoyed it. I chose quiet and felt strong. Jason waved from across the deck. Mark stayed in his cabin. Claire slept late. Robert tipped his hat. I stood at the rail and said nothing. I watched the water move forward. I realized power had shifted without effort. I smiled once. I kept walking. The deck was quiet when Claire found me. She said, I knew you would be here. I replied, it is calm. She stood beside me and said, I am sorry. I waited. She continued, no excuses. I lost more than I gained. I nodded once. She asked, do you believe me? I said yes. She said, then can we fix this? I answered, belief does not mean return. She flinched but stayed. She said, I ruined everything. I replied, you changed everything. She said, I was weak. I said, weakness explains nothing. She looked at the water and said, I thought I wanted something else. I answered, wanting does not replace respect. She wiped her face and said, I hate who I became. I said, I forgive you. She looked up fast and said, really? I said, for me. She asked, not for us. I replied, there is no us. She said, Mark is gone. I asked when. She said, this afternoon. I nodded. She said, he argued with my parents. It was loud. I replied, I am not surprised. She said, everyone saw. I answered, truth shows itself. She asked, do you feel better? I said, I feel clear. She swallowed and said, my mother wants to talk to you. Linda approached slowly. She said, I owe you an apology. I said, go on. She said, I handled this wrong. I asked how. She said, I protected my comfort. I replied, that apology is late. She nodded. I know. I said, some moments cannot be fixed. She said, I accept that. She stepped back and left us alone. Claire said, I wish I could go back. I replied, I do not. She asked why. I said, I learned who I am. She said, I learned too. I said, I hope you grow from this. She asked, without you? I answered, yes. She said, that hurts. I said, growth often does. She reached for my hand. I did not move. She said, say goodbye properly. I said, this is proper. She laughed softly and cried again. She said, I never wanted to lose you. I replied, loss happens when choices meet truth. She said, will you remember me kindly? I said, I will remember myself kindly. We stood in silence for a moment. She said, thank you for not being cruel. I said, I did not need to be. She said, I will always regret this. I answered, regret teaches. She nodded. Goodbye. I said goodbye. Jason waved from a distance. He said, you okay? I replied, yes. He said, you handled it well. I said, I handled it honestly. He nodded and left. I stayed on the deck after Claire walked away. I felt a door close inside me. It did not slam. It settled. I breathed in and felt lighter. I whispered, I am free. The words felt true. Robert joined me and said, endings can be gentle. I replied, this one was. He said, that means you grew. I smiled. I think so. He said, safe travels tomorrow. I thanked him. I watched the lights reflect on the water. I thought about holding doors open too long. I thought about knowing when to let them close. I chose peace. When I returned to the cabin, I packed quietly. I did not rush. I folded the last shirt and felt steady. I looked once at the ring on the table and left it there. I turned off the light and rested. I slept without dreams. I woke ready to leave. Morning came with announcements and rolling suitcases. I stood in line to disembark. Jason stepped beside me and said, you ready? I replied, I am clear. He smiled and said, that matters more. I handed him my phone and said, let us stay in touch. He typed his number and said, anytime. I thanked him. He said, you handled this with strength. I answered, I learned it here. Robert approached with his hat in hand. He said, endings reveal character. I said, you helped me see that. He shook my hand and said, remember what you earned. I asked, what is that? He replied, peace without permission. I nodded and thanked him again. He said, walk forward. I said, I will. Claire stood near the exit with her parents. She did not come closer. She watched me. I met her eyes and nodded once. She nodded back. No words were needed. I felt no anger. I felt finished. Linda looked at me and said, take care. I said, you too. That was all. I stepped onto the gangway and felt the floor steady beneath me. The ship stayed behind. Outside, Jason asked, what now? I said, home. He laughed. Simple answers suit you. I smiled. They do. As we parted, he said, you changed. I said, I chose myself. He said, that shows. We shook hands and went our ways. I walked alone toward the terminal doors. I said quietly, love without respect is loneliness. The words felt earned. I said, silence can be strong. I believe that too. A voice behind me said, safe trip. It was Robert. I turned and said, thank you. He tipped his hat. You are welcome. He turned away. I watched him go and felt grateful. Inside the terminal, people hurried past with stories I did not know. I checked my phone. No new messages. That felt right. I booked a ride and sat on a bench. I breathed slowly. My chest felt open. I thought about the man I was when I boarded the ship. I said to myself, you were afraid. I answered, you are not now. I said, you wanted approval. I replied, you have clarity. I nodded and stood when my ride arrived. In the car, the driver asked, good trip? I said, it taught me. He laughed and said, best kind. I agreed. As the car moved, I saw the ship fade behind buildings. I did not look back again. I felt calm. I felt present. I felt ready. My phone buzzed. A message from Jason read, proud of you. I typed, thank you. That was enough. I planned simple things. I planned work. I planned mornings with coffee. I planned quiet evenings. None of them included explaining myself. That felt like freedom. I remembered the night air on the deck and the choice I made. I said softly, you kept your dignity. I believed it. At a red light, the driver said, we are here. I paid and stepped out. The street felt ordinary and new. I adjusted my bag and started walking. I said, this is not the ending I planned. I smiled and added, it is the one I needed. My steps felt steady. My shoulders relaxed. I reached the door and paused. I took one deep breath and said, I did not lose myself. I opened the door and said, I found myself. I stepped inside and closed it behind me. I stood in the quiet and felt peace settle. I set my bag down and looked around. The future waited without demand. I nodded once and began.